Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to take a few minutes, well, this might take me a little bit longer, maybe 10 minutes, and say just a few things about Aristotle's physics. And as with the categories, I won't even begin to approach the beginning of all there is to say about the physics, but I'll try to remind us of some of the points that we discussed in class, and in particular I'll try to provide a little bit of a transition from the categories to the de anima. So in looking at Aristotle, we began with the categories, and then we moved to the physics. We were in the de anima when we left for the break, and then we're going to be resuming shortly with the Nicomachean Ethics and a little bit of the politics. So the physics will help us transition from the categories to the de anima, thinking about some of the big picture features of the physics. So if you remember in the categories, one of the questions that Aristotle is raising is the following: what among existing things, of the basic entities that are out there, or the entities that are in the world, which of those entities count or qualify as ousiai? Which are the most fundamental ones? So ousia is an abstract noun formed from the participle of the Greek verb, the being verb, einai. And to say that something is an ousia for Aristotle, or that a kind of thing is ousia, is to say that it's fundamental, that it's basic, and that it's basic both in the ontological ways we distinguished and in the epistemic sense that we talked about. Now, in the physics, and maybe I should say something quite generally about the physics, the project of the physics, you shouldn't think of the project of the physics as being terribly close to what we think of when we think of contemporary physics or modern physics. Contemporary physics involves, for example, the application of mathematics, the language of math, to the measurable properties of what we can observe. You're trying to characterize the basic phenomena or the regularities of nature in mathematical terms, and that's not what Aristotle is doing in the physics. The project of the physics is a little bit closer to what we might identify with philosophy of science or with conceptual analysis when it comes to the concepts of science. So Aristotle is really in the physics, he's working through a series of concepts and a series of related puzzles that arise from thinking about the natural world. So he treats the notions of time and infinity and change and purpose and chance. These are questions that he investigates, and the concepts associated with these questions are things that Aristotle investigates in the physics. Now, one very big picture way to think of the relationship between the physics and the categories is the following. In the physics, you see Aristotle factor, as it were, those entities that the categories characterizes as substance, that is, concrete particulars, individuals like Socrates or Felix the cat or the bottle of hand sanitizer there. He factors those things which he identifies with substance in the categories into form and matter. So in the physics, Aristotle begins to apply his hylomorphic analysis to a range of phenomena. That is to say, he talks about things in connection with their form and in connection with their matter. So what are these notions? Well, one preliminary thing to say is that these two notions, form and matter, correspond to two of the four modes of explanation, two of the four causes that we discussed: the formal, the final, the material, and the efficient cause. And when Aristotle is asking about a thing's form, when he's asking what the form of a thing is, that inquiry really answers, it's a kind of epistemic inquiry. To ask what a thing's form is to ask what its definition is, to look for an account of the thing. Aristotle identifies a thing's eidos. He says the form expresses the account, the form expresses the logos, and if you want to know that account, you have to grasp the form. He also says, and this is a kind of a difficult way of putting it, he says that forms are not separable, and that's directed towards Plato, obviously. The form of a thing is not separable from the thing itself, except in thought. So what does that mean? You can separate it in thought. What does that mean? Well, he means that a form is the kind of thing that can be an object of thought. It can be an intentional object. You can grasp it with nous or intelligence, and that's precisely what you do. That's the thing you grasp when you understand what a thing is. Now, in some cases, to grasp the form of a thing will be to grasp its structural features, or its shape, its morphing. To understand the form of a statue is to understand the shape of the statue. In other cases, to understand the form of a thing, you have to understand its its functional characteristics or its defining functions. That's true in the case of artifacts, and it's also true, importantly for Aristotle, in the case of organisms. To understand what an organism is, you have to understand the set of capacities of eunomase, functionally defined or functionally characterized capacities that constitute it as the living organism that it is. So to understand the form of an organism is to understand the capacities that constitute its soul or its life. The same would go for a range of artifacts for Aristotle. Aristotle, for example, if you knew about computers, he would say that you have to understand a computer, the form of a computer in terms of its functions and its functionality. That's what it would be to grasp its ethos. So that answers to this broadly to a kind of epistemic inquiry, a line of epistemic inquiry. Hule, matter, answers to a kind of ontological inquiry. Remember that in the categories, Aristotle thinks that individuals, particular things like Socrates, satisfy what I referred to as the persistence criterion. So they are the things that in the categories persist through change. And when Aristotle is looking for the underlying thing that remains and the thing that instantiates the accidental qualities that come and go, he says, well, it's the concrete particulars, such as Socrates. And what he's saying that primary substances are neither said of anything nor are they present in anything, he's thinking of them as basic in the ontological sense. Now, in the physics, these notions come apart. And you see the factoring of those individuals into their form and into matter. And one thing that motivates Aristotle's hylomorphism, that is, his analysis that proceeds by appeal to form and appeal to matter, one thing that motivates that is Aristotle's reflections on the phenomenon of change, or coming to be, genesis, in the physics. And I'll just say something briefly about how that goes. So in Physics 1 and 2, Aristotle refers to, or talks about, works through, discusses three different kinds of coming to be. Now he mentions one kind of coming to be, talks about one particular kind of coming to be in the categories when he says it's most characteristic of primary substances that they receive contraries. So that was the case we discussed when we mentioned Socrates going to South Padre Island and acquiring a tan. He loses his pallor on the beach there and he acquires a tan, but he remains Socrates, which is to say he remains the particular thing that he is. Cases of change are coming to be like that. We could characterize those in sort of Aristotle's terms by characterizing them as insubstantial change because the substance, Socrates, the particular substance there, the particular thing Aristotle calls substance, persists through that sort of change. So accidental change, or insubstantial coming to be, when the substance remains what it is and gains and loses some accidental qualities or properties, that sort of change is perfectly consistent with the ontology of the categories. No problem there. But there's another general kind of change that Aristotle considers. And in thinking about change of the second sort, he begins to think in terms of form and matter. What kind of change is that? Well, in Aristotle's terms, we could call that substantial coming to be. So not all change is a matter of gaining and losing, not all change of the kind that Aristotle considers is a matter of gaining and losing accidental features or properties. Sometimes the things Aristotle characterizes as an individual, as a substance, an individual particular in the categories, change into another kind of thing. So some of Aristotle's examples, when a pile of bronze becomes a statue, a lump of bronze becomes a statue, a pile of wood becomes a house, when an acorn becomes an oak tree or a zygote becomes an animal, those are all cases of, well, substantial coming to be of a certain sort. One kind of thing, the acorn, comes to be a second kind of thing, an oak. Now Aristotle also sort of mentions in passing another kind of substantial coming to be, which you could think of as unqualified substantial coming to be, or absolute coming to be. Coming to be, substantial coming to be simply, what would that be? Well, if Socrates popped into existence right here in front of me, we don't think about change like that very often because it never happens, at least at the ordinary level. Socrates popping into existence would be a case of unqualified or absolute substantial change, a change from nothing into something. And Aristotle agrees with all ancient thinkers, well, ancient Greek thinkers, for example, that kind of coming to be doesn't happen. It's not possible. Ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. So he doesn't he doesn't countenance, he doesn't recognize unqualified substantial change. But in the case of qualified substantial change, one kind of thing becoming another kind of thing, if you ask the question, well, what persists through change? So change always involves a kind of persistence. In order for something to change, the same thing has to be present in some sense at T1 and T2, right? And it also involves a kind of difference, something with one kind of characteristic coming to be something with a second kind of characteristic. And in the case of qualified substantial change, if you ask, well, what is it that persists? You can no longer give the answer that Aristotle seems to have in mind in the categories. You can't think of particulars or individuals as persisting through substantial change. So when the acorn becomes the oak tree, you have one kind of thing becoming another kind of thing, and the acorn doesn't persist. So what is it that persists? Thinking about that question presses Aristotle in the direction of treating matter as a kind of substance. Because in cases like that, it's the hule of the thing that seems to persist through the change. Now in the physics, Aristotle in Physics 1 and 2, which we looked at, is asking a question not directly about substance, but about physis. He's asking, well, what is a thing's nature? Although he sometimes uses physis and ousia almost interchangeably in those contexts. Talking about a thing's physis seems to be a way of talking about its basic nature or substance. And he's pulled in two directions, and the physics is inconclusive on this question. Aristotle says something very characteristic in the physics. Well, in one way, form is substance, or sorry, form is nature, or nature is form, and in another way, nature is matter. He's pulled in those two directions, and it's through thinking about change of these different kinds that he begins to talk about form as being nature in one sense, and matter as being nature in another sense. And the physics doesn't give us a conclusive. He has more to say about that in the metaphysics, but it's really through thinking, working through these puzzles about change, at least in a simplified account of the physics, you can think of Aristotle as working through these puzzles about change and arriving at the conclusion that we can no longer say that individual particular things have the best claim to be substances, because you have to recognize the distinction between form and matter. In particular, you have to recognize it in these various kinds of change. So that's all by way of trying to introduce hylomorphism in 10 minutes, and then when we get into the De Anima, we'll see how Aristotle applies that analysis of form and matter to the case of living things, to the case of organisms. And in those cases, the form of the thing is identified with its psyche, it's with its soul.